Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. When I was a little girl on the farm, we would have something called garden end soup. And that was just all of the veggies that were left after almost everything else had been harvested. And my grandma would put it all together and freeze it. She had these plastic quart freezer containers, and she would cook it all a little bit, put it in there, and then later on, when we got ready to eat it, she would add whatever kind of meat she had, or no meat, sometimes just broth. But it made the best soup, and my mother did it too, and this is my version of garden end soup. I didn't have a garden last year, so I didn't have a garden end, but I usually do also freeze little containers of leftover veggies. I'm going to show you how I make this. It's really yummy. While we're getting ready to cook, give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you will. I really love it when you do that. Now let's get cooking. Now this is basically just a beef veggie soup, and everybody's got a beef veggie soup recipe. I'll just show you how I make mine. It's a little different. I kind of layer the flavors in here. I have beef today, so I'm going to have beef broth. I've got a can of crushed tomatoes. Back here I've got one potato cut up, diced small. And this is just a can of veggies. I've only used one potato because there's some potatoes in the mixed veggies. I'm going to start out with a little butter. I've got some ground beef. And I chopped up pretty small, an onion. Now, if you're making this soup with the actual end of the garden, you might have okra, and you might have squash, and you might have green beans. And by the way, I'm going to add a little cabbage to this that I didn't show you. I'm going to melt a half stick butter and start to caramelize. Well, not fully caramelize, but start to wilt my onions in that. And the ground beef I'm using is not particularly lean. I don't want a lot of butter in here, but I do like the flavor of the onions cooked in the butter. You could use a little vegetable oil if you would rather. Now, I have to say, the only thing I regret about this particular batch of soup is that I didn't have any okra. You know, when you grow a garden in the South, the okra is about the last thing that's still growing. That was about a half teaspoonful of salt, by the way, and I may add some more later. In our garden, we always had, by September, you had too much okra in the freezer. Just so much okra. And you didn't want to put up any more okra, so our garden end soup always had okra in it. And to me, that makes it just perfect. But I didn't have any, so I didn't put any in. So I'm just going to let these onions cook on a medium-low heat until they start to take on a little color. These are red onions. This is a red onion, but they'll start to take on a little gold color. And then when that's done, I'll be back. So after about 2 minutes, I'm going to add the ground beef. Now this is cheap ground beef. It's going to have some fat in it. Now when my grandmother and my mother made it, it might have sausage. It might have chicken pieces. Just whatever meat you had. We always had chicken and chicken broth when I was growing up because my mother and my grandmother raised a house full of chickens every time they could. That was the extra money that you got. That's how it used to happen. They would bring you the chickens. They would bring you the food. And you would raise the chickens and then you would sell them back for so many pennies a pound. And that wasn't a lot of money, but that was a long time ago. So it went a long way. So I'm going to smush this up. If you were using sausage, you would use it the same way. We always had a lot of sausage because we always raised hogs and we'd kill them every year. And yes, I am a carnivore. But little pieces of chicken, pulled pork, whatever kind of meat you have left over, you can use. So I'm just going to chunk this up until it's almost done. It's not quite done, but it's got some browning on it, and I'm going to add the potato. And we didn't usually put potatoes in our garden soup. We added it later because Granddaddy would grow lots and lots of potatoes, and he would hill them up outside to make them last through the winter. He would put down a layer of straw, and then he would put down a layer of potatoes and a layer of straw and a layer of potatoes and make a whole tower of potatoes and cover the whole thing up with canvas. And we would just go dig out potatoes when we wanted them. So we didn't freeze them in the soup. We added them later. And as I said, I only added one potato this way because this can of mixed vegetables has a little potatoes in it. So now I'm going to add a quart of beef broth. Clarification, we didn't always have broth. We usually had broth. We almost always had chicken broth. But if not, you can make this without the broth. You can just have tomatoes. But it really has so much better flavor if you go half and half tomatoes and broth. So for the tomatoes, I'm going to add a 28-ounce can of crushed tomatoes in tomato puree. Now, when we made this on the farm, we froze the tomatoes in with the soup mix because we cooked the tomatoes and the okra and the squash and the beans and the peas and all of that together and froze that in quart containers. If you're not using the broth, you're going to add another quart of tomatoes, which, of course, we always had canned tomatoes. It's times like these I really miss having had a garden last year, but I'll have one next year. So I have this little can of mixed vegetables, and I've drained the liquid off, and I'm just going to put that down in there. And this has got some corn and some green beans and some carrots in it. A small pack of frozen mixed vegetables would work just as well. So I'm going to add a little cabbage, and I almost always add cabbage. The cabbage will grow all winter long, just about. And I only added that's about a half cup of cabbage, maybe 4 ounces, and I sliced it really thin, almost like noodles. There are 100 variations of how to make this soup, by the way. As I say, you could make it with any kind of meat that you have, but when you've got beef, I would sometimes add some kidney beans and some macaroni and change the spices a little and call it minestrone. So I'm going to taste this because I'm pretty sure it's going to need some more salt. When you're adding canned vegetables, you really don't know how much salt's in them. So I want to test it. And, there was salt in the broth. And that's pretty good. It does need a little more salt. And I'm going to take this time to add some more spices. So that's about another half teaspoonful of salt. And I'm not adding pepper to this just because I don't particularly care for black pepper. But you could, and you could also add some red pepper flakes. And what I always try to put in my savory meat soups and stews is, that's a 1/4 teaspoonful of garlic powder. I don't want a lot of garlic flavor in this, but a little bit just sort of gives it a deepness and a heartiness of flavor. But I also always add just a tiny little bit of cumin. Something about the cumin, and that's 1/8 of a teaspoonful of cumin. Not too much, don't overdo it. But if you add just a little bit of cumin to beef stew, chicken soup, whatever kind of savory soup you're making, it really brings the flavor out. If I had some squash, I'd add some squash. I'm going to add a little bit of oregano just for the flavor, and I said minestrone, and it made me think of it. And that was about a half a teaspoonful of oregano. Now, you can do this in your crock pot if you'd rather, by the way. When you get your onions and your ground beef browned, pour this whole thing in a crock pot and add the rest of the ingredients and go away and leave it for a while. I'm going to taste for salt again. I'm going to let this simmer for an hour to an hour and a half on a very low heat. Really just cooking it enough to let the flavors meld together. Keeping my heat low. This is good. I don't need to add anything else to it. I'm just going to put the lid on and let it simmer for an hour to an hour and a half. When my cornbread's done, it'll be done. Because you know you gotta have cornbread. So you may wonder why I made a video of something as simple as vegetable beef soup. Well, for a lot of reasons. Mainly, I think everybody needs to have in their repertoire of cooking one dish that's big, can be made easily, is cheap, will feed a lot of people, and still be a nutritious meal. And the other reason is because I think sometimes those of us who have cooked for a long time take knowing how to make some things for granted. And there are a lot of folks that are just learning. And there are little tips and tricks that we experienced cooks can share with people just learning to be self-sufficient in the kitchen. This is one of those meals. This is how I serve this soup. I always have cornbread with it. If you make it into minestrone, you might have a salad and an Italian roll. But I love the cabbage in this soup. And I love the easiness of having it mostly pre-made. Just put that cornbread right down in there. That the way my mother and my grandmother did it, and the way I do it when I have a garden. And if you have a garden, then almost all of this can come right out of the garden. And if you don't have the meat, then just make it with the broth and tomatoes, and it's going to still be rich and very deep tasting. I'm going to have this for my dinner. I'm going to be full. I'm going to remember my grandma making this for me in the winter. This is comfort food for me. Hope you try this recipe. Put your own variations on it. Hope you like it as much as I do. And I hope to see you again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.